Script and narration are by Phil Gregory. The video was taken and the sound mixed by Tom Borkowski for the program committee. This video presents the beauty of the Pillar and Scroll exhibit prepared by the staff of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors at the Columbia, Pennsylvania Museum. A book was published containing many of the exhibit clocks. It is available for purchase online from the museum store and may be checked out from the library. The idea for this exhibit came from the guest curators, George Goolsby and Terry Brotherton of Houston, Texas, who supplied the majority of the clocks. Additional clocks for the exhibit were selected by Phil Gregory, the acting executive director, with the assistance of Carter Harris, the museum curator. The American Clock and Watch Museum, Chris Brown, and Virginia and Ed LaFawn also furnished clocks, and a few are from the museum permanent collection. The Pillar and Scroll clock became the first shelf clock to be mass-produced and thus available at an affordable price to consumers who were financially able to afford finer things for their home. At the time of invention of these clocks, about 1813, there was little need for a clock in the home. There were no railroads, and those functions operating at a particular time, churches for example, would ring bells to notify those involved. Having a clock was a status symbol, and therefore it was desirable to be attractive. The clockmakers achieved this by gold leaf on the dial and a reverse glass painting below the dial. Clocks were the first item in the world to be mass-produced. The first were by Eli Terry in 1806. These clocks consisted of the movement, dial, weights, etc., and the owner must select a joiner or carpenter to make a case. Since the movement required a drop of 4 to 5 feet to run 30 hours, they were called tall case, or today, grandfather clocks. The Pillar and Scroll case style was so popular that by 1830 there were over 30 companies in Connecticut building these clocks, most using Eli Terry's patented number 5 movements. These clocks sold at a value that would allow the maker to have sufficient funds to buy a house in a year. This was the dot-com boom of the time. However, all booms must come to an end, and this one did in the Depression of 1837. Within a few years, there were only 7 or 8 builders left. The clocks in this exhibit start with those having 30-hour wooden tall case movements. Then the exhibit progresses to 30-hour shelf clock wood movements and ones having expensive 30-hour or 8-day custom brass movements. These brass movement clocks were developed by makers who did not use the Terry design, but rather tried to modify tall case brass movements to take advantage of the Pillar and Scroll case popularity. The makers did not want to pay royalties to Terry or did not have the funds to set up a mass production line. Following charts have a lot of information, and you may want to pause the video to study them. This chart identifies the parts of a Pillar and Scroll case. The letters lead the viewer to the pieces of the clock and help establish the nomenclature for further discussion. For example, the letter A directs the viewer to the finials. Letter E directs the viewer to the tablet. Next, the parts of a Terry number 1 wooden geared movement are identified. These parts will be similar in later Terry movements, although arranged differently. Terry revised his movement through 5 steps before settling on the production version, which was widely used by him and others. Examples of these 5 versions will be shown. Lastly, the wide variety of craftsmen required to produce the materials and parts of the clock are shown. The clocks were assembled with hide glue, few nails were used. Since having a clock was a status symbol, it was desirable to be attractive. The clockmakers used gold leaf on the dial and the reverse glass painting border. The idea of these paintings was taken from the mirror or looking glass industry. Mirrors cost more than paintings, so the looking glass guys would put one at the top of the mirror to add beauty and lower cost. The paintings were generally done by young girls living in the clockmaker's home. Here the 5 steps of reverse glass painting are shown. On the upper left, the gold leaf for the bob opening is placed on the glass, and the bob opening design is hand etched. On the upper right, the layout for a stencil border has been made. On the left, second row, the gold stencil's been backed with black paint, and the design has been drawn with India ink on the glass. 2 trees have been painted with oil. On the right picture, building colors have been added. At the bottom, sky and foreground colors. To review the steps in detail, first the gold leaf is placed on the glass and a bob opening etched or scribed on it. The design to be retained is backed with asphaltum and the excess removed. Then the border is added. The area for the border is marked and gold leaf laid and scribed to create a design, or stencils are used over varnish to hold gold bronzing powder. Now the gold leaf and stenciling have been backed with black paint, and a building and trees have been drawn with India ink. The color is added with oil paint. Houses at the time had red shutters. The windows indicate the shutters are closed. The building color is added with suspicious shading under the porch. It is not clear where the light is coming from. The blended sky is a typical view at sunrise or sunset. There would be no clouds. The foreground and hills are achieved with broad brush strokes with light and dark shades of green. The bob opening is clear. First clock is where it all started. Eli Terry was given a contract from the Porter brothers to supply 4,000 clocks by 1810 at the rate of 3,000 per year when in full operation. The Porters then sold the clocks, so Terry was free to resume inventing. The movement in this clock is from that contract in 1809. The movements were numbered. It was purchased by a furniture maker in 1834 to be cased as his personal clock. The quality of the cherry case is beyond most examples made at the time. The hands are made of cast lead, and there's both a second hand and a calendar. The whale's tails and finials on the top show the influence of the later pillar and scroll design. Next is the result of Terry's work after the Porter contract, 1814. It is a box with a strapwood movement, Model 1. The back of the clock is the back of the movement. The pendulum hangs off-center, and the movement uses a brass rack and snail mechanism to regulate striking. The clock runs 30 hours with double-hung 2.5-pound weights. Because the dial features are on the back of the glass door, trial and error must be used to set the hands to the correct time. The 1816 version of Model 1 has little changes in the four-train movement, but adds the pillars, scrolls, finials, feet, and reverse painting that give it beauty and its name. Seth Thomas was satisfied with this design and purchased the right to produce and sell the model built in his own factory. It can be instantly recognized because the pendulum bob is off-center. The dial is painted on wood rather than the back of the glass, and there is no veneer separating glass over the dial and the tablet. The Thomas label credits Terry's patent. Model 2, as built after 1816, has movement improvements. The brass rack and snail mechanism has been replaced with a wooden count wheel. This is the more common clock. The gold leaf border is only on 3 sides. Since Thomas made many of them, the quantity was probably limited by Thomas's ability to sell them, as the tooling would permit 3,000 to 4,000 to be built in a year. The Thomas label is in the clock, but reference to Terry is dropped. The appearance was improved by adding a strip of veneer between the glass over the dial and the tablet. The brass finials are a unique Thomas style, different from Terry's. The Model 3 movement, 1817, made and cased by Terry, was of no interest to Seth Thomas, so he continued to produce Model 2. It has an outside escapement, and the movement is attached to the back of the dial. The bob is centered, the weights are double hung. Attaching the movement to the dial was a poor decision, as the dial now had to support the weights, and if it shifted, the clock would not run. Note the different finials. They are hollow and attached by a wooden peg. The next version of Model 3 had manufacturing improvements, but having attached the movement to the dial still fundamentally flawed the design. Note there are several holes to aid in assembly, and there is a larger time post which would allow the hour hand to be attached with a pressure fitting and thus be easily rotated to change the hour. A few of these box clocks with Model 3 movements are in existence. They were probably experimental, or an attempt to introduce a less costly case design. It's not clear that there would have been savings commensurate with the loss of beauty from dropping the pillar and scroll features. Our next Model 3 example retains the movement attached to the dial. This is a good picture of the stripe side showing the wooden teeth. This is an example of a custom-made case or an attempt to introduce a deluxe model. Very few exist. The detail in the fretwork includes accent pieces marketed as ivory, but probably bone. The same material is used in key escutcheons on all clocks of this generation. Note the extra horns on the base and the extensive use of maple veneer as accent. The dial has an interesting design with a music sheet and horns, and it has raised gesso decoration covered in gold leaf and strawberries in the corner. There is more detail than usual in the painting, 2 houses and a very intricate border and centered bob opening. Model 4 movement is another four-train design whose backplate is the back of the case. It mounted the escapement on the front of the movement behind the dial. The label claims it was patented, but no patent exists. In later years, there would be a penalty if a patent was claimed and none existed. The beehive painted on the dial was a popular design. The tablet has 2 houses and an interesting design etched into the gold leaf border. The painting is flaking, which is very common, as in later years these clocks were stored in extremes of temperature and humidity. The hands are stamped sheet iron. At last it all comes together. This case contains a Model 5 1821 movement which became the standard of the industry. It has a 5-train movement allowing the weights to be single hung. The weights were originally 2.5 pounds, but most have been replaced with 3-pound OG weights designed to run the coming brass movements. Terry was satisfied, and he put his sons, brother, favorite foreman, and those willing to pay him royalties into the clock business. After setting up these shops, he would collect royalties and proceed to the invention of brass mechanisms. The U.S. developed the ability to produce rolled sheet brass in 1830, which led to the demise of wooden movements. With the movement standardized and many more shops in production, the development turned to variations of the case and decorations. Note the extensive gold leaf on this clock by Eli Terry in the dial, as well as the tablet and the tiger maple veneer accents. The "Don't Give Up the Ship" design is a sticker covering a hole in the dial. These hands are stamped pewter and not very strong. It's not unusual to see them bent. There were variations in the movement production. Some movements have wooden pivots on the strike wires and some are iron. Note the variations in these two clocks and the similarities. The dials had raised gesso relief covering the gold leaf. There are also bands of gold leaf on the dial. Note the chapter ring is inside the Arabic numerals. Later models used Roman letters as numerals, and the chapter ring is outside the numerals. The use of Roman numerals reduced the cost, as it was not necessary to use a calligrapher to paint the numbers. The Roman numerals could be done with a straight edge. The variation in tablets and dials was important, as no two households would want the same appearance in their status symbol. The clock on the left knob has a knob to open the door, and the other has a key lock. If the key was used frequently, eventually the escutcheon would be pulled off the case and lost. This is a common repair using piano keys. Our next example is later, probably made in 1829, and shows some manufacturing changes. The strike wire pivots now are wooden rather than iron, as on earlier models. The count wheel is still retained by a wire positioned at 12 o'clock. This example by Terry & Sons is called a whale's tail. The tablet has a stenciled border, which would reduce its cost while remaining attractive. The border is rather plain compared to the etched gold leaf and compared to later stencils by Fenn. The tablet has less detail than earlier ones and appears more primitive. The hands are of cast pewter. The next two movements were made by Riley Whiting, 1828. It's easy to recognize his movements as he used a wooden bridge to hold the escape. There's also a variation in the location of the strike wire pivots compared to Terry's. Whiting was a super salesman who got his customers to pay for very fine clock paintings. He had started with tall case movements in 1807 and was unique in that he made their cases. He switched to pillar and scroll late and made modifications to the number 5 movement in order not to pay royalties to Terry. One clock features Romeo and Juliet. On the back, someone has written, "Tybalt, you're a dummy." The other Riley Whiting clock has Aurora, the goddess of the dawn, as the tablet. Aurora was very popular on banjo clocks in Boston. There are small differences in the column tops. Perhaps he began to contract out case manufacture and concentrated on movements. Whiting died in 1835. This movement avoids the Terry patent. Designed by Chauncey Boardman based on his tall case movement, it requires a longer drop to run 30 hours, thus cases are longer than Terry's. It is used in these two clocks. The one to the right is by Jerome. Jerome also made a thin version using a movement designed by his brother Noble. Jerome added reeded columns and carved capitals. The Terry-type finials are original brass. The dial retains gesso with gold leaf designs. The Arabic numbers are outside the time ring with an attractive etched gold leaf below the ring. The tablets are original and may be the first to use stenciled borders to reduce costs. The painting has a typical design but with poor perspective. The lower tablet is required because of the height. It's all stencils. Note the lower bob opening. Some versions originally had a mirror. The movement is called a groaner. The 30-hour movement for this clock was designed by Joseph Ives. and manufactured by Chauncey Ives around 1818. The movement has the verge between the plates and uses rolling pinions, a mark of Joseph's movements. Note the reeded columns on each side of the narrow dial. The mirror has been resilvered on the original glass. The finials are replacement. The hands are hand-cut sheet iron. The clock's 37 inches high. This clock used the Boardman movement, which was made by Orrin Hart. It uses 4-pound cast iron weights and is 38 inches tall. It may have had a tablet that was broken and replaced by veneer. The lower tablet is a later day silkscreen replacement. The dial uses the familiar gesso and gold leaf designs. Once Terry's patent expired or he stopped defending it, these manufacturers switched to the Terry No. 5 movement and their cases became shorter. It was not easy to defend a patent as it meant taking time off or riding to court at the Capitol. Patents at the time were signed by the U.S. President. Seth Thomas eventually switched to the No. 5 design, and Terry won a court case against him when he didn't pay royalties. This movement is for a rare miniature clock. It is time only with a Jerome factory movement, probably invented by Noble Jerome, his brother. It was an attempt to provide variety in the market, but only a few were made. Note their intricate design in the gold leaf border and bob opening, and the use of gold leaf and the raised decorations on the dial. The clock is 24 inches high, 3.5 deep, 13 wide, with a 4-pound cast iron weight. Jerome was in business in Bristol, Connecticut until 1844. This movement was by Silas Hoadley, who got his start as a carpenter in the first Terry factory. As a self-trained clockmaker, he designed the upside-down movement to avoid the Terry patent. The winding arbors are above the time shaft. To compete with brass movement clocks, he designed the bushings of ivory, probably bone, in 1837. He was the brother-in-law of Ephraim Downs, who set up shop in 1825 to make movements for the industry. Hoadley made about 3,000 woodwork clocks per year and was one of the last to quit in 1845. Hoadley eventually moved to production brass movements. Norris North produced this movement in 1818 that avoided the Terry patent. The trade calls it an east-west movement. His brother Ethel also made these movements. He went into bankruptcy in 1825, and his shop was bought by Erastus Hodges, who kept him as a partner until 1831. Note the variation on the pillar and scroll design with a different base and the reeded columns. The clock is 26 inches high with a 3-pound cast iron weight. The dial is metal, although some are made of wood. The hands are later replacements, and the finials are correct. They are slightly smaller than those on the other Connecticut clocks. And here is the same Norris North movement from an Erastus Hodges clock. These clocks are narrower than the normal, plus borders on the top and bottom only, with no side border for the reverse painted tablet. The tablet is a replacement, but has been done correctly. Clock is 28 inches high. Sometimes this style clock has the label of Norris or his brother Ethel. The clock business ended in 1837 with the Depression, but few clocks were made after 1833. Hodges had other businesses until his death in 1847. This picture is of Mark Leavenworth. He designed a movement to avoid the Terry patent, but later modified it and increased the size and credited Eli Terry with the patent design. The movement is used here in a miniature only 23 inches high and 13 inches wide. The weight is a lead block, the tablet's original, the hands are replacements with a later style. It was manufactured by Sam Cooke, who was related to Leavenworth's wife. In 1830, with the death of Sam, Mark used movements by Ephraim Downs in full-size pillar and scrolls until going out of business in 1837. Leavenworth employed as many as 40 workers at his peak production. The first movement is by Joseph Ives. The following four clocks are examples of makers using 8-day brass movements in cases similar to pillar and scroll. These makers could not compete with the cost of 30-hour production wood movements, so turned to variations of their tall case 8-day clocks to take advantage of the popularity of the pillar and scroll design. This is a very rare clock on loan from the American Watch and Clock Museum. It has extensive, good quality reverse glass paintings around the dial and in the tablet. The dial surround is a typical Ives approach. The clock's 38 inches high and 20 inches wide with lead weights. Ives was a talented movement designer but a poor businessman. His company went bankrupt in 1819 and he moved to Brooklyn, New York, where he first produced wagon spring clocks. He again went into bankruptcy, and John Burge in 1830 bailed him out of debtor's prison and brought him back to Bristol to design the first 8-day production brass movement in 1831. The next three clocks use the brass movement made by Heman Clark. The first clock was cased by Clark in the classic pillar and scroll design. Clark was the apprentice who worked for Terry in 1806. He purchased the prototype tall case movement factory and then sold it to Seth Thomas in 1813 when Thomas started making pillar and scroll cases for Terry. He then completed the design of an 8-day brass movement that Terry had started. The movement is called a Salem Bridge. The tablet is original, the dial is iron, and the weights are lead. The use of this movement was casemaker Lucius Bradley. His case uses elaborately called pillars. The iron dial used both stenciling and painting with hand-cut sheen iron hands. The finials are replacements. The replaced tablet commemorates the Lafayette visit to the U.S. in 1825. This painting was particularly associated in clocks by Bradley. The pillars are very distinct with different carvings top and bottom. He discontinued production of pillar and scroll clocks in 1832. The Salem Bridge movement was handmade. Case makers probably received the movement from Clark in return for cases. The cases are 2 to 5 inches taller than conventional pillar and scroll. The next movement is in a case by John White. The case is a standard pillar and scroll with a Salem Bridge movement. It has an outstanding original reverse glass tablet depicting a memorial to George Washington. White was a carpenter. He may have been a casemaker for Heman Clark. Clocks by him are very rare. The dial is of iron, there's no label, and the finials are replacements. The originals may have been wood. It became popular for collectors to replace wood finials with brass ones. Samples have shown that over half of the pillar and scrolls originally had wooden finials. The movement in the next clock has the distinctive Riley Whiting characteristics. Whiting sold movements to the trade. The pillar and scroll by William Sherman of Buckland, Massachusetts, had so many variations it's generous to call it a pillar and scroll. The top has double finials of wood. There are 4 pillars that have been extensively turned and round feet. The mirrors are replacement. The dial has distinctive Connecticut characteristics and may have been supplied with the movement. Some of these clocks have stenciled splats. Sherman died in 1834. Ephraim Downs made this next movement. He made movements for the industry, including my favorite, Arenas Atkins, who never made a pillar and scroll. Clocks with the Downs label were likely made from cases supplied in payment for movements. The case was made by Moses Baker of Providence, Rhode Island. Note the wooden finials and the turned feet. The tablet is a replacement. The dial is distinctly different with less corner decorations, but detail inside the chapter ring. There is little information about this maker, but the label credits the Terry patent. Ephraim paid Terry royalties. This movement is by Mark Leavenworth, who stopped making his design in favor of the Terry number 5. Terry's patent had run out, or he stopped enforcing it. A local merchant in Vienna, Ohio, funded Phineas Deming, the casemaker. Again, note the wooden finials and the Connecticut style of the dial with stencils for the border. The tablet is a correct replacement. It should use a 3-pound weight, but has a 4-pound weight and stamped sheet iron hands. These clocks made around 1830 are rare. This is the famous Asa Munger movement. It's time only with a 5 seconds bit mounted on the seat board. Munger made variations of the pillar and scroll case with reeded columns using prison labor to reduce cost. This very unusual clock by Joseph Barrett of Ithaca, New York, uses an 8-day brass time and strike movement with the 30-inch high cases cherry and curly maple. The dial has very attractive reverse glass stenciling and a gold leaf border. The columns have extensive turning, being different top and bottom. The base is also carved. The finials are replacement wood. The replacement tablet has both stenciling and hand painting, picking up around the theme from the dial, which is original. Burt and Atkins had a patent for a calendar clock. Burt clocks are very rare. The clock has a note from his surviving granddaughter giving details. The maker of this handcrafted movement is unknown. The winding arbors are not centered with respect to the time arbor. It is almost generous to call this a pillar and scroll, but the carving is of such quality that it'll be generous. Again, notice the wooden finials and the extensive carving on the pillars. The dial has the time ring outside the Arabic numbers, indicating a late 1830 time frame. The tablet is a William Fenn stencil and transfer. It is thought that Fenn was not yet doing transfers, so it must be a replacement. Even if it is a later replacement, it's an outstanding tablet. There was probably a stencil in the bottom tablet. Case is 42 inches high. The fine lady's name is Amelia. Daytime and strike movement was made by Arthur Johnson of Hagerstown, Maryland, about 1825. Johnson is best known for his high-quality tall case clocks. The highly patented lower panels are an indicator of styles to come. The movement is patented after a Salem bridge design. The dial is quite large. It shows the tall case influence. The case is 35 inches high. The hands are hand-cut sheet iron. He was thought to be an apprentice of John Scott of Pennsylvania in 1801. He died in 1846 at the age of 66. The maker of this movement is unknown, but in the next clock are of Allentown, Pennsylvania type. The 30-hour time and strike movement would appear to be of German origin. Again, many clockmakers were trying to take advantage of the pillar and scroll case popularity using modifications of their tall case movements. The outstanding Connecticut reverse glass painting is a replacement. The Allentown design using painted iron dials. This one has intricate flower paintings. It has hand-cut sheet iron hands. The case was made by Samuel Terry and is so labeled. Again, the maker of this movement is unknown, but it is a German-style tall case, causing the case to be 5 inches deep. It has a wood frame with brass wheels. The case is of Pennsylvania origin, made of cherry with mahogany veneer. The dial of metal must have been painted by the same artist as the previous clock dial. It is believed that dials were made and painted in Germany. The tablet has a reverse glass transfer painting of a morning scene. When shown in the home as a wall picture, it would have the name of the deceased in the area of the painting here used for a bob opening. This movement was made by John Scarf of Slints Grove, Pennsylvania in the late 1830s. It's handcrafted 30-hour time and strike with compound pulleys. The case maker is unknown, but it has wooden finials and Connecticut styling. The case is 32 inches tall and 5 inches deep. The dial is painted iron in extraordinary good condition. The tablet is a later Connecticut replacement from mid-1830s with a stencil border. Sharp was Swiss-born. One characteristic of his clocks was to use a pendulum made of very thin, lightweight metal. This movement made by Jacob Custer of Norristown, Pennsylvania around 1830 is unique with a so-called dumbbell count wheel. The movement causes the case to be 30 inches tall and 6 inches deep. It is a 4-day time and strike. The dial is similar to tall case dials, size and decorations. It's been painted on iron with border trim painted to look like wood. The columns look surprisingly like stair banisters, and they may be. The finials are replacement, the feet are turned, the wood paneling is outstanding. Custer's clocks are rare and unique. Some are made with calendar mechanisms and moon dials. No sooner said than here we go. Another 1830 Custer movement with a moon dial. The movement is very well made with a rack and strike. The lead weights are compounded to permit the clock to run 8 days with a 34-inch height. The case design is substantial and very striking. Again, the columns look like stair balusters. The dial shows the tall case styling with outstanding paintings. The finials are wood and the hands are cut sheet iron. This very well-crafted 8-day time and strike movement by Joseph Burke of Pittsburgh has a calendar. The hands are cut brass, obviously a derivative of a tall case movement with compounded lead weights, probably around 1833. Very original design on the corners of the dial. The tablet has a Fenn bob opening, but the painting is from a local artist. The finials are wood, and except for the bottom feet, it's a copy of the Connecticut Pillar and Scroll. Another Pennsylvania 8-day time and strike movement made by John Albert around 1825. There were a lot of tall case makers trying to capitalize on this popular design. This movement has an alarm. Albert specialized in tall case clocks until 1820. The case is 47 inches high, 7 inches deep, of cherry with mahogany veneer. There are very long turned pillars, but a conventional splat with wood finials and turned feet. The dial is painted iron. The hands are fancy cut sheet iron, typical of tall case clocks. Surprise! Here's a 30-hour with a calendar movement. Made by George Soliday, the bottom columns are fully turned. The top ones are halved. The conventional top has wood finials. The dial is painted iron with hand-painted corner decorations. The hands are hand-cut sheet iron. It's over 4 feet tall, 7 inches deep, and 20 wide. This Empire-style clock is massive and impressive. There's a functioning drawer in the base. Made in 1834, features of this clock are similar to those of 8-day production brass movements started in Connecticut in 1831. This video has traced the development of the pillar and scroll case from the very plain early strap wood to sophisticated dials with floral paintings, splats, with unusual carvings and decorations. We started with tablets with no border and stylized reverse glass paintings and developed into including moon dials. The columns became extensively carved. Gold leaf dial surrounds were added to give distinction and to provide variety, and the columns were more extensively carved. Patents were claimed when there was none. Tall case manufacturers tried to introduce variations based on their past products. These found a very limited market and few exist today. Their cost was high compared to the conventional pillar and scrolls, which were produced on production lines by the thousands. They depended on unique features such as an 8-day operation, outstanding artist paintings, and calendars for sales. Most of these makers left the clock business as the market for these unusual clocks at high prices was not large. Let's review the features of the pillar and scrolls, which are made by the thousands, and some of the one-offs. Wood movements, fancy dials, unusual splats, calendars and second bits, carved capitals, carved pillars, and most important, reverse glass paintings, stencil borders, hand-etched gold leaf borders, skilled artists, primitive artists, a skilled artist on the dial, and gold leaf with gesso decorations on the dial. All were made to be attractive in the house. It's been a weird journey. As a reminder, the book documenting this exhibit with pictures of the labels and some clocks not in this video is available from the museum shop and library. We are indebted to Terry Brotherton and Joel Goolsby for being the motivating force that started this display. The Pennsylvania History and Museum Commission and Chapter 139 provided financial assistance. 5 very fine special clocks from the American Clock and Watch Museum enhanced the 19 clocks from the guest curators. There were also 12 from the collection of Chris Brown and 3 from Ed LaFond. Carter Harris, with Katie Knobb, Phil Gregory, and Lee Davis, developed the physical design of the exhibit and the text descriptions. The museum staff did the construction of the exhibit with help from various. Deanna DeLuca and her capable staff polished the text that are shown in the exhibit.